What direction do I think Dracula studies will go in the future? Well, I'll tell you where I think I would like them to go, and that is, as interesting as Dracula, the novel, is, and as much like an onion, the more you peel back, the more you learn, I also feel that way about some of Bram's other stories, and I would really hope that all the scholars who've put their energy, enthusiasm, and their skills into dissecting Dracula, I would really hope they would sort of do the same thing with some of Bram's other stories. The Mystery of the Sea comes to mind, The Water's Mouth, Jewel of Seven Stars, and some of the short stories that I think are fantastic, The Squaw, The Judge's House, and The Burial of Rats. Those are the first ones that come to mind, but I think we can really get to know and understand Bram when we get to know some of his other stories as well. I look forward to what I hear in the next 125 years.
I really think Bram Stoker's Dracula is the key vampire in the history, whether we're talking about folklore, literature, stage, film. I don't see us ever getting away from the grasp of Dracula. While we may learn more information about Stoker, we may learn more information about the writing of the novel, we may continue to see Dracula go through certainly evolutions with each new film, each new generation. A lot of the films, I think, speak as much to their generation as they do Stoker. But I don't think we're ever getting away, wonderfully, I don't think we're ever getting away from Stoker's Dracula.
So 125 years after Dracula has been published, it's still absolutely central to the field of vampire studies. Where do I see this going? What direction might vampire studies go in, and how will Dracula fit into that? So I think Dracula is always going to be a hugely important text for vampire studies. In popular culture, they're almost synonymous. So you'll find people saying a Dracula when they really mean a vampire. They don't distinguish between the two. That means new thinking about Dracula and its impact is always going to be at the heart of vampire studies. I think there's two main potential ways in which we'll come to new research areas on Dracula specifically. So one is going to be the emergence of new materials which haven't been seen before, and the other is going to be new interpretations of what we already have, i.e. the novel and the related adaptations and notes and so forth. So first of all, on new materials, a surprising amount has popped up over the last decade or so for a novel that's 125 years old. So we've had the Icelandic first and then Swedish newspaper adaptations of the novel that have come to light. There's also been the journal that Bram Stoker kept when he was a young man in Dublin, as well as obviously his own notes that he took in the course of writing the novel, which have become much more easily available now that those have been published. But there's still a lot of archival material out there. I don't think all of it has been fully tapped. I suspect perhaps there's going to be some more stuff to come out of the family archives that will give us new insights into who Bram was, how he thought, his world and his work. But obviously it's hard to predict, isn't it, the nature of what's going to appear. That's what it is, really. That's the character of new material. So we'll just have to wait and see. But people are looking hard. So whatever is out there, I'm sure it will be found and will be hugely interesting. As far as reinterpreting what we've already got, the novel and what fits around it, I think there's probably still a lot to do with the dimensions of race and othering in Dracula. And it's not that no one has looked into this. We know, of course, it's a story of East versus West. It's a reverse colonisation narrative. So in other words, it expresses the fears of people living in a colonising society about what it would be like to be colonised themselves by Dracula coming to England. We know that it draws on pseudoscience like physiognomy to give Dracula the physical characteristics of a so-called criminal type. We know it includes anti-Semitic and anti-Roma stereotypes. So that is all there. People know about it. People are already talking about it. But I think in the discipline of vampire studies as a whole, People have been thinking harder about race and the other recently. So, for example, the Open Graves, Open Minds team did a brilliant conference a couple of years ago on the Black Vampire, which is a riff on Polydor's The Vampire, written in 1819, set in the context of the Haitian Revolution. And also race and sort of racist stereotypes is something that's come up very strongly in the discussions around the Swedish version of Dracula, now that that's available. So it now turns out that basically the Swedish adaptation of Dracula leaned pretty heavily into that subtext in the original novel and basically made some of what was implicit racist framing in Dracula explicit in this adaptation. And I think that's very important because I think it actually tells us a lot about what contemporaries got out of Stoker's novel within a few years of it being published. This is what the Swedish adapters saw in the novel of Dracula, in which they made explicit. So I think that's probably likely to prompt people in the light of that to take another look back at Stoker's Dracula and think about how those themes are there within the story to be made explicit by the Swedish version. And that might be quite an uncomfortable process for some of us, but I think it's really important to do that kind of rereading, rethinking if we want to understand how Dracula operated in its original context, what it meant to its original readers, and to carry on engaging with it today. That's what we need to do. Reread, rethink. We've been doing that for 125 years, and I'm sure there's another 125 worth of it still to go.
So what direction do I see vampire studies going in? Well, vampire studies has advanced quite a lot in the last 50 years, so I would say, apart from the era in the 18th century where vampires were first really debated and discussed in depth, especially after the Serbian cases from the 1720s, 1730s. But after that, I think the next biggest leap was probably the 1970s, where you had writings like Raymond McNally's and Radu Florescu's In Search of Dracula, Leonard Woolf tackling the novel and also writing A Dream of Dracula, kind of beatnik kind of exploration of the subject almost. You've got Anthony Masters, Natural History of the Vampire, just a lot of popular writings coming around at the same time. And I think what kind of kicked the door open for vampire studies today is that there was a kind of a slight hint of truth to what people have been taking for granted for many years. For example, that Vlad Dracula was, at least his name, and a little bit of his characteristics was actually based on a real person. And I think that kind of provided an impetus for people to think, well, if there's a bit of truth to that, then maybe there's a bit of truth to the vampire myth as well. So fast forward to 1988, where you get a work like Paul Barber's Vampires, Burial and Death, which provided a kind of forensic analysis of vampire exhumations from hundreds of years ago, and then determined it was basically a case of mistaken identity. But where I see the most development is, of course, in literature and film, where it's kind of opened up to various discussions from lots of different viewpoints and disciplines and perspectives. And I think we're going to see so much more of that come out. We're going to see more. It's a field that's not just restricted to a kind of a white Western audience. It's such an archetypal, flexible figure that you can view it in many different ways. So all the feminist takes, there's psychoanalytic, sociological, so many different layers and interpretations you can provide. And I believe we'll see a lot more input from, not the not just English language sources, but global ones too. In fact, I compile bibliographies of material of vampire scholarship written over the previous year, and what I see of all places, a lot of input coming in from Turkey. So there's some that comes in from Asia, and I think that will start to blossom and expand a lot more as time goes on. Where it takes us is that's the great fascination of the vampire itself, that it's so flexible and adaptable that it can continue forever.
This is one I've actually thought about quite a bit over, particularly the last 20 years. Back in the 90s, we were saying we've exhausted the Dracula theme in novels, and half the novels, vampire novels that have ever been written since 1990. Well, one of the things we found these new translations of Dracula that weren't really translations; they were rewritings and attempts to take Bram Stoker's novel, put it into the local lore. The Turkish Dracula has Dracula in Turkey and Istanbul, and the Swedish and the Icelandic Draculas have him in Scandinavia. I think part of our agenda for Dracula for the next years, and I don't know how many, will be to discover if there's any more of these kind of rewritten storylines for Dracula coming from that first generation. And then what does that tell us about the reception of Dracula overall? I think we will be reevaluating that. We're going to also be rewriting our scholarship in terms of the questions that we're asking about Dracula. We've had a generation in which the scholarship of the late 20th century dominated the questions that we ask about Dracula. There's a whole new set of questions now. Questions about gender, questions about race, questions about colonialism, etc. And I think we're going to redo our opinions about Dracula and about vampire literature in general, based around those questions that are coming up. Oh, the new book of essays on Dracula come out. We still have a lot of 19th century Dracula and vampire literature that we haven't found yet. And that's going to reshape how we understand the influences on Stoker. There's a whole set of new findings of short stories and poems and news items, etc., in the different European languages, especially concerning vampires. And as we uncover that new body of material, we're going to have a much fuller understanding of the 19th century. Kevin Dodd, his book, I think, is going to provide us with a whole agenda for the next generation. I wish I was going to be around to participate. I think it's going to be an exciting time. I don't think that Dracula studies are passé by any means.
Well, I think, like a lot of myths, the vampire myth, particularly in Dracula. By the way, when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he gave a presentation copy to the ex-Prime Minister, William Gladstone, in England, and he wrote inside it, "I think I've included all aspects of the vampire legend, ! Best wishes, Bram Stoker." So in a way, all aspects of the vampire myth, mostly, but nearly all, not all, but nearly all, are contained in this book. So there's lots to choose from. And of course, movie makers and fiction writers and short story writers and comic book people and graphic novelists have been picking up elements and running with them, because there's an awful lot in there, you know. At the moment in cinema, it's the superhero. You know, the tradition that began with Blade and went through Van Helsing and Underworld and now is in Morbius. The idea of the sort of half human, half vampire who has all sorts of control over bats, and you're never quite sure, you know, it's a sort of strange half supernatural, half natural world. So that's, who'd have thought it, you know, the vampire as superhero. And within vampire studies, it's a lot of interest in gender, in identity, in colonialism, you know, the idea of the Count becoming a sort of colonial master in England, a reverse mirror image of the British Empire in a way. So all these are very fashionable subjects being projected into the novel Dracula. In fact, you know, since the 1950s, the novel has taken the temperature of what's in the ether in the academic world, and people find it in that novel. So it's a very rich thing. At the moment, it's identity and gender, I would say, are the two basic things. So who will say what the fashionable academic areas of the future might be? You know, it certainly won't go backwards. It'll go forwards in some way. I'm not sure. In cinema, after the superhero thing, well, what next? We've had The Addict, we've had the Buffy at school, we've had Twilight, we've had all sorts of variations lately. And amazingly, you know, on British television, there was a version of Dracula which appeared earlier this year, I think on New Year's Day, written by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, the two people who did Sherlock, which proved that even telling the old story again has a lot of mileage in it. What they did was move the Count center stage so that he talked much more, and it was partly about his problems. You know, how does this guy who's condemned to eternal life, how does he cope with getting through the world? So that was part of it. You know, it was Dracula's own problem became center stage. Whereas, of course, in the novel, amidst all the documents and the phonograph recordings and the journals and the diaries, the one document that's missing is anything from Dracula himself. He's an absence. His voice is not there in the novel. Well, what they decided to do was alter that and make his voice the central thing, you know. And secondly, to make Van Helsing into Sister Agatha, so that it's a female Van Helsing. And thirdly, to have the first half of the thing set in Victorian times, and then the second half in the modern period with a big jolt and so on. So they're retelling the Bram Stoker story, but in a way that makes it fresh. And I'm sure that future generations will do the same. It's like productions of Shakespeare. That you go and see a production at the Royal Shakespeare Company, or I'm sure in Ontario as well, and it's like seeing a different play, because the director and the styles of acting and the design of it, and you know, that it's like a conductor with a musical score. The score is the Shakespeare play, but in interpretation, it takes it in all sorts of different directions. So I think the same with Dracula, that Dracula is the score, and in future it will be taken in all sorts of directions. We can't quite predict, but we know it will still live. So my punchline is Dracula lives and will continue to, because successive generations will project all sorts of things onto it. That's what myths do.
As always, we think there's always lots of answers to this. I think it's interesting in terms of the recent Netflix series they had. It's quite a curious point to kind of go from, just for the during the pandemic, how much streaming became the way to sort of consume new texts. And I think the way that Netflix has used the figure of the vampire in things like Midnight Mass, Blood Red Sky, and even Night Teeth, even though that wasn't that good. But it's really interesting the way it's starting to still expand the ideas of how the vampire can be used, and the kind of vampires that we see as being the main kinds. I mean, particularly with like Midnight Mass and Blood Red Sky, that kind of return to the Nosferatu kind of style vampire, which is actually in some ways closer to Bram Stoker's view of a vampire rather than the Hollywood view. And that's really interesting. How, of course, it's 100 years of Murnau's Nosferatu this year as well. So it's coincidental that those two things coming together, and that seems to be a very fertile way of going back to this more feral idea of vampires, and perhaps that they are not so much supernatural, but actual species in their own right. So I think that with kind of like Dracula moving forward, I think there'll be more of a return to maybe more probing into the idea of how vampires are not necessarily cursed by God or something, but are actually some kind of vision of humans, but maybe future humans, a kind of post-human idea, and that there are other species and we don't necessarily need to be just food for them, but we might evolve along with them.
It's an interesting question, I think, because in so many ways, the discipline of vampire studies is coherent and cogent. We're interested in the undead. We're interested in the evolution of the undead. The vampire is a cultural mirror. The vampire is a socio-political cipher. I think these things will continue on in our discipline. I think our discipline is very rich with those kinds of readings. And as vampires continue to appear and evolve, we will most certainly be interested in how that, charting that journey. I think Dracula is absolutely central to that evolution, because as much as we try and imagine that there are several important Draculas across the decades, particularly in film, sometimes in television as well, I think actually Dracula is continually renewed. We can never fully capture the essence of Dracula, and therefore we're constantly reimagining it and reevaluating it through plays, through novelizations, through counter novelizations and postmodern reimaginings, through film and television. So I think as a result, Dracula will always be sort of the master vampire behind the evolution of the subject and the subfield. So I think he'll always have a part to play in it.
As for the influence of Dracula in the field of vampire studies, I think it is and will remain the central text. It has been translated so many times, it has been adapted for more than 200 movies, it has influenced all later vampire fiction. But still I see a certain shift when I look at our Children of the Night conference. I see that academic staff from the humanities is looking more and more into the reception, the influence of the novel, the many vampire movies, the role of vampires in children's books, the foods that have been inspired by vampire culture, and the contributions to what I would call the hardcore research about the origins and the intentions of the novel. They come more and more from academic outsiders, like Mike Shepard, who has been looking into the Scottish sites, the influence of Slane's Castle, the books that were studied by Bram at the London Library and at Marsh Library. They were discovered by librarians. Of course, they are academic people, but their first job is to take care of the library. And in the field of the first foreign editions, it has been Simone Burney from Italy who has been writing an important book about it. And Simone, he is a book hunter. He's not a scholar by profession. The same for the new translation from the Swedish. Has been organized and published by Will Trimble from Chicago. And Will, he is a number cruncher. He doesn't come from languages or the humanities. And still he has discovered very important facts about this Swedish text that other people have not even been looking into. Same for Locke Heiss from the US, who is looking into the role of Emily Gerard's book. He is a physician. Niels Petersen, who has been studying the book by Van Schertz. He has a background in science. So I think that the book will continue to be studied very intensely also in future, but it won't always be the staff from the humanities departments that is willing to do this work. And maybe you should ask yourselves why. Don't they have the time, the motivation, the means, the incentives to do this nitty-gritty groundwork? Dive into the archives, even learn a new language in order to answer the last open questions about the Dracula novel.
I suspect that people will continue to use various lenses to explore Dracula. As I said earlier, I've been actively working with Dracula since 1970 and was fortunate enough to begin that exploration at the time that so many people started taking the novel seriously. During my lifetime, I've watched scholars look at psychological readings, beginning with Ernst Jones, folklore, feminist studies, including my own and other readers who are interested in the new woman, historiography, post-colonial studies, popular culture, and science and technology studies. I see value in all of them. However, because Dracula has been adapted in so many different media, I suspect that we will continue to look at adaptations in film, comic books, video games, and whatever is on the horizon that I can't even begin to imagine. I'm a book person. I occasionally venture into other media, particularly film, but I'm basically a book person. But nonetheless, I think people will continue to study Dracula in new ways as new critical strategies emerge. And I think right now we can't even begin to imagine what's on the horizon. And I think that Dracula will be right there.
Thinking about the future of vampire studies as an area of research and writing really grew out of literary studies, in many respects, it grew out of this kind of recognition and people beginning to look at the Gothic and key works like Dracula and others such as Polidori's The Vampire and Le Fanu's Carmilla. So it grew out of literary studies, but it gradually expanded in kind of later decades towards thinking about film and television. And Dracula has been central to all of those areas. So I think for me, the future of vampire studies is going to be increasingly about the kind of multimedia extended life of the vampire. It's going to be the ways in which the vampire is now spread across so many different media, different narrative forms, different experiences, from immersive theater to video games to long-running television dramas. So I think for me, that sense of vampire studies now extending to think of this kind of almost tentacle-like spread of the vampire across media. And again, this ties into what I was saying earlier about the vampire being linked to modernity, is that there's something about the way in which the vampire becomes an ideal subject for new technology or new media or different incarnations of media. So I think for me, that's kind of the future of vampire studies, is going to be thinking about these other platforms of expression, from like I said, video games to anime, etc. And I think Dracula will always be central. I think Dracula is central to every kind of new platform that begins to explore the vampire, because Dracula, in many respects, while it's by no means the first vampire story, it's developed a life as like the uber text, the one which sort of consolidated vampire conventions, it consolidated certain expectations and understandings of the vampire, particularly if you think of it as a genre of literature, a genre of storytelling. And so I think when the vampire kind of moves into new media, it's often Dracula becomes a key starting point. That you want to say, let's take this text and put it into this media form, or into this narrative form. So we see Dracula being really key to early television horror. That it gets adapted quite a few times in the 60s and 70s as a kind of means of rethinking the role of television in the kind of telling of vampire stories, horror stories, gothic stories. So Dracula becomes that starting point, and then it begins to then influence other types of vampire tales. And so I think we're always going to see vampire stories kind of turning to Dracula as a form of kind of reinventing the narrative for a new platform or a new location. So one of my favorite texts of late has been the Netflix anime series Castlevania, which is this really interesting global text designed for Netflix, in which they want to, trying to draw audiences to Netflix, particularly at a time when it was really looking to expand its membership. And Dracula, Castlevania based on a video game, it moves into Netflix as an anime series. It just somehow that having Dracula at that center, even though the story then continues to include a range of other vampires from literature, as well as lots of new characters, it kind of offers a framework to help audiences engage with these new media forms. So I think those will be the kind of key areas that vampire studies will extend to. And the final thing I would add is that I think it will become increasingly globalized. A lot of the focus of vampire studies has been upon kind of Anglo-European content. But increasingly, there's now an increasing awareness of the ways in which this mythology has been borrowed, rewritten, re-examined, reinvented around the world, from different adaptations of Dracula, like translations that really evoke into adaptations, because there's a lot more substantive changes to the story to suit the kind of different contexts, to adaptations around the world. And again, Dracula, I think, is a central text that will propel a lot of our discussions of these kind of global texts, as we kind of expand vampire studies to think about the development of this mythology around the world.
I think that Dracula will continue to be an important novel for vampire studies and vampire scholars. It's just so filled with so many productive, irresolvable ambiguities, so that even if we will continue to invoke it in order to show the discrepancy between authorial intent and what ends up being communicated or shown, or even if we want to talk about how people present the ends as justifying the means, it will still remain to be a very important book, I think.
Interesting, because I did do my thesis on vampires losing their religion in the film genre, and at SDSU. And that's where I think it's going still, when I see the genre evolving away from Dracula, away from the old school kind of way of looking at vampires being so thick in religion and folklore. Now we're getting more into the science fiction part of the genre, I think, and I think that's where it's heading. But I think it's still, you still need to know where it came from. So it will be, I think, always, oh yeah, some people will still say it's a Dracula movie instead of a vampire movie, because it's so just entwined with each other. And I think it will always be there as like a background, because it's so good, because it started it all. And then I think the genre is moving away from it though. But I think we do need a base. And I think that's what Bram Stoker totally just nailed it for the genre.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind after reading this question is that actually vampire studies is, to a large extent, Dracula studies. I mean, the field wouldn't exist without Dracula. At some point in time, the name Dracula became synonymous with the word vampire, and that's, I think, that how it's perceived all over the world. Once again we need to just bow down to Bram Stoker and thank him for giving us this wonderful book and starting it all, because it's a huge phenomenon when you think about it. And we're talking about it in the 20s of the 21st century, so really, he deserves all the respect in the world. Where it's going, where is the discipline going? It's hard to say, of course, but when you think back on the discipline of vampire studies, you have obviously your Dracula studies, which is a separate field of studies in academic sense. Then we had the whole Diagesis, which is part of Dracula, so the whole world on the level of the book was discussed already. And if you have cinematic productions, there is the whole new field to look at, and you have mise en scene, you have characters again, and evolution of the vampire and so on. And then and then I'm only talking about Dracula now, and there is plenty more to come. Then comes this discipline, which is quite broader and includes other vampires that sprang out of Dracula's fame in the 20th century and in the 21st century as well. So we have the world of vampires as they were appearing either in literary words or in the cinematic world, and they have been discussed as well very clearly. The thing that is discussed probably most often now is this tendency of the 21st century, which I am fascinated with as well, of humanization of the vampire. So the new trends took us into looking at vampires as creatures of human desire, but also as creatures who desire human features, humans in general, but also they want to become more like humans. So it's like, and who knows where it's going? Well, it's hard to guess, because there is always going to be a scholar or two who's going to think about something completely new, some new approach, some new ideas, theories. Very easily proven every time I'm going to a conference, a convention, a meeting, I talk with my Dracula friends and so on, and there is always someone who's going to propose a view which is completely new. I mean, I've read the book so many times, I've seen so many films, and I've never thought about this aspect. And then it seems obvious, of course, but that's a normal thing that happens on all these academic meetings or festivals. So it's very hard to guess where it may go, but one thing I know for sure is that it's not going to end. I mean, this fascination with Dracula, this fascination with Bram Stoker's novel, with the TV productions and cinematic productions, theater productions, with music that contains the subject of Dracula and vampires, are never going to stop. They are going to continue with every new generation, because this is this kind of a book. So Bram Stoker has succeeded in writing a book that is probably one of the most beloved novels in the world, and the most cultivated ones among every new generations. And funnily enough, every new generation is able to find something for them, something that the previous generation didn't see and didn't think about in this way. So I think that this is partially that this book became such a phenomenon, a massive phenomenon on a mass scale, and it is never going to end.
As I've discussed elsewhere in my work, Stoker's Dracula is the confluence point where all preceding representations of vampires converge and from which all ensuing ones emerge. It all goes back to Stoker. There is no field of vampire studies without Stoker's Dracula, or at least it would be entirely different without Stoker's Dracula. My expectation for future representations is, reflecting current trends and emphases, the continued proliferation of technologized vampires on the one hand, and multicultural ones on the other. Monsters inevitably reflect the cultures that spawn them. That's kind of the first rule of monster studies. So what we can expect from our vampires, as Auerbach explains in the title of her book, is that they will continue to reflect ourselves.
I'm having serious doubts about this whole vampire theory. For heaven's sake, who in all of England, by the very furthest stretch of the imagination, could possibly be a vampire?
Count Dracula.
Well, maybe him.